Hey, it's Joel. Thanks for checking out this video. EQs. I wanted to do a video on EQ just to put a thought in your mind when you're working specifically in the DAW environment, working with EQ plugins. The vast majority of EQ plugins today, such as this one here, which I adore, I will admit, the Filter Bank. It's old. It's been around for more than a decade. What was one of the first things Colin did over at DSP, and still is one of my favorite EQs. This is a later version. Love this EQ. It's got a display down here. You can see the EQ curve that you're making. Somewhere around here, I've got a channel strip. There's a channel strip. It also has a graphic display. You look at all the wave plugins, everything. I've got a screenshot here of FabFilter. I don't actually have FabFilter. Heard nothing but good things about it. I just don't own it. But when I was looking for a picture of wild screenshots, wild settings, I looked up plugin EQ or something. I Googled it and looked at images, and this popped up. And that's an impressive picture because there's a lot going on there, and it's very cool to think about what that plugin is capable of doing. And some people may buy it because they look at that and go, wow, look at all the stuff I can do. Those types of settings are good for effect, and maybe on the rare occasion you get some really whacked out signal that you've got to mangle to make sound acceptable. But generally, that's not the kind of stuff you're going to use. Those types of settings are not what you're going to use for EQs. You're going to use more gentle settings such as that, or even this, which is a pretty wild setting. That's on my room mics, and you can look at my video on room mics to understand what I'm doing there. I've got boosting a lot of low end into compression so that I make the compressor wind up a bit and get more of a full room sound. But but this has most EQ plugins have a visual display of the curve, which can be very helpful. I also think it can be very harmful if you're relying on it, because then you're mixing with your eyes and not your ears. And I must confess, I realized a few years after, I cut my teeth, and the first few years I was recording, I was working on an analog console, and even with the analog recorders, but also with ADATs and DA88s, 20 years ago. But when I moved finally into Pro Tools and started mixing on the screen, I realized after a while, I'd come back and listen to a mix the next day, and I would realize that something just didn't sound the way, way too much low end, or that instrument's way too aggressive. And it's just stuff that I hadn't noticed while I was working on it. My ears kind of acclimated to the mix. And I think that's happened to all of us. We come back after a day or two and listen to a mix and we go, whoa, how did I miss that? And I began to realize that all the things that I would go back and then correct because of that were things that had pretty wild settings. And I realized that, when I'm thinking, okay, well, I want to boost the lows, and I want to, cut the low mids so it's more of a scoop sound. And that looks like kind of what I'm thinking I probably ought to be doing to the sound. What good is that? Your eyes can't hear anything, But either that, or how often have we, like, say, for example, over here, well, it's a different EQ that does not have a visual display. But how often, for example, like I know this is a 1081 clone, and so I'm going for it, but I accidentally say grab this one, which is the one that's feeding the input of the reverb. And then I start tweaking things, and I'm listening to the vocal, but this is affecting the reverb send. And I'll actually, make a tweak and move things around. And I'm kind of thinking, boy, that's subtle. I'm not really kind of hearing that, but I'm also kind of hearing it. And I'm thinking, yeah. And then I'll move on to something else. And then only to realize and come back later, to hit the actual vocal and look and go, that's not, I didn't do that. What, anyway. And then I realized, oh, I was EQing the wrong thing and I didn't notice. So those kinds of things happen. When we're using our eyes, not our ears. It wouldn't happen probably so much on a 1081 because that one doesn't have the display. But if I was doing it with this plugin, I'd be making tweaks and I'd be looking at it, and in my mind I'd be hearing that, yeah, this is getting brighter. It's wow, it's subtle, but it's there. It's happening. No, actually, you idiot, you're EQing the wrong thing, and you're just playing tricks on your mind, on your ears. So that's just the thought. The thing that really kind of drove this home to me, sorry, I just remembered something. So what I started doing was closing my eyes or just looking away. I generally monitor. I don't know. I've now started making videos with my little camera here built into my laptop. That's cool. Um, as I'm working, as I'm listening to things, if you hear me audition things in videos, you'll probably notice that I tend to look down or I'll close my eyes. But I tend to look away from the screen because I just want to hear. I want to hear what's happening. I want my ears to be the thing that's telling me stuff. Because if I'm watching my audio, whether I'm watching waveforms here, and watching the time click along, and here comes the vocal, and maybe I'm looking for a loud breath or something, and so I'm looking, whatever it is, I'm watching, and it affects what I hear. Well, I just want to listen. Back in the analog world with a console and a tape machine, you might have a counter to watch, but that's it. You couldn't watch your audio. So I want to do that when I'm working now, and that definitely holds true when I'm looking at a graphic display of an EQ. I might grab a parameter or a dot on the display and then start moving it around, but I'll look away while I move it and let my ears tell me what is going on. So to demonstrate how I use EQs, I use a lot of these UAD, the 1081s and the other Neve, not the 1073, but the 31102. I like that a lot. Love the Harrison. That's a workhorse EQ for me. I use it a ton. But I thought it would be very interesting to show you the actual curves of settings. Now, this is a song that I mixed.
Sweet little daisy, leave your woes behind.
Just kind of a country train feel.
You've got the good looks and I've got the time to.
And I mixed that out of the box. I have a lot of outboard gear, and I use my tone bus and all that. So that's actually mixed out of the box, but I did have all of these settings in here as part of the mix before the stems were going out. So I am going to go ahead and show you some of the settings. But I have this thing here called Q-Clone. Now, if you've never heard of Q-Clone, Waves makes it. It's part of my Waves bundle. And it's a neat device because it's meant to be routed. This thing, the Q-Capture module here. It's a two-part thing. The Q-Capture module creates a tone, that a pulse wave or whatever that it's sending through an EQ circuit, and then it comes and then it listens to it. You return to it. So it's meant to go to the outside world and go through like a Nave 1084 or something, and then back into the computer. And then however I set my 1084, it will copy that and then allow me to just put it on as many tracks as I want to. And I can use all different settings, and on each of the individual plug-in instances, I would use Q-Clone and I would hit capture, and capture would capture whatever is going on outboard. Well, I've routed this to an aux input, so this thing never leaves the session. It stays in, and it allows me then to take, for example, the primary vocal reverb or vocal EQ, which I'm getting ready to show you. I'll set that up so it'll stay there. And I will copy this vocal EQ and drag it over and hit capture so you can see what that curve actually looks like. So this is actually the curve that I used using this 1081 plugin on the vocal. Of course, while I was mixing, I wasn't looking at the curve at all. I have to use Q-Clone to see the curve. But it's obviously a boost. It's a broad boost, kind of all the way across. I'm using all four bands, and I'm cutting a high pass filter, on down at the bottom. But that's a subtle curve. The EQ that I'm using on my reverb. Let's take a look at that. I just want to show you some of these settings. These are actual settings that I use. So I chopped off the bottom and raised up the mid a little bit. The EQ that I used on the delay, which is on the vocal. Again, I'm boosting the mids and a little bit to give it more clarity and chopping off the ends. Let's take a look at this Harrison here. This is on an acoustic track, I believe. Let's see what I did to this acoustic track. See what that curve looks like. Okay, so I'm boosting some lows and chopping off the bottom. I generally use a lot of high-pass filtering, so usually the bottom is chopped on most things for me. This is another acoustic track. So again, I'm pulling out low mids, leaving the top a bit, but the extremes are trimmed away. Here's a snare drum. Let's see what I'm doing on the snare drum. Yes, there's automation. I do want to copy it anyways. Look at that. Big boost. Look at this at 330. Big boost of that's probably, I don't know, well, actually, what is it, about 8 dB it looks like on that. That's a 16 dB scale. So this, but still, these are generally broad settings. There's nothing radical about these curves. And particularly with the older style EQs, I think here's a Pultec. Drop the Pultec in there and see what that bad boy's doing. I mean, look at that. It's nip and a tuck, you know. It's hardly doing anything at all. A slight boost here, a little bit of attenuation. It's really not doing much. Oh, the inside of the kick drum I thought was pretty fascinating. I looked at that earlier. Look at that. So I'm boosting up the lows and bringing down the mids a little bit. And that's kind of all I'm doing. Boosting the lows and pulling back some mids. That's pretty much it. Take the EQ out. Oh, wrong one. Boom. Yeah. And it's also kind of neat too, these vintage plugins, these vintage model plugins. Even when you bypass the EQ, the circuit itself does, these old devices, and I have a pair of 1081s, and they do have a character to them, and not just a distortion and slew rate and all the, you know, the actual characteristics of the circuit itself, but it does actually affect the frequency response too. As you can see there, when it's flat, it's still not truly flat. So anyway, all of this to say, don't use your eyes when you're looking at your EQs. Make sure that you make your adjustments while you're looking away, because when you trust your ears, the ears are all that's going to matter when it's done. It doesn't matter how cool your gear looks in the rack. It doesn't matter how cool the plugins look. I mean, this is great artwork. They should be very proud of how this looks, and I'm excited to use it. It looks cool. Like, yeah, I want to use it, but the bottom line is, the settings and the curve that you're using and all that, none of that matters. What matters is what does it sound like. And generally, if things are well recorded, you're going to wind up using really subtle and smooth and graceful curves on all of your EQ settings instead of dramatic, crazy things, except for like effects and whatnot. So I thought it would be cool to point that out, to just sort of show what some of these settings that I've actually used look like when all is said and done. So sorry if I got long-winded. I hope that's helpful information. Thanks for checking out this video. Please check out my other videos, and also would you check out my blog at joelcameron.com. I would appreciate it very much, and thanks for watching.